The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. We will be starting this webinar at approximately 2 p.m. Please hold. Thank you for your participation. Good afternoon. We will be starting this webinar promptly at 2 p.m. Thank you for your participation. Good afternoon. We will be starting this webinar promptly at 2 p.m. Good afternoon. We will be starting this webinar at 2 p.m. Thank you. Good afternoon. We will be starting this webinar at 2 p.m. Good afternoon, and welcome to Learn to Build with Resilience in Mind, Floodplain Construction Training. Thank you for participating today. My name is Kelly Sadler, and I am the International Code Council Government Relations Regional Manager for Texas. As the United States recovers and rebuilds from the devastating effects of hurricanes like Harvey and Irma, it is important that we design and build stronger, both with new construction and when we rebuild non-firm compliant structures. This all starts with an understanding of the International Code Council's Residential and Building Codes, the ASCE 24 standard, FEMA guidelines, and best practice approaches seen during Hurricanes Harvey and Irma. This educational webinar will be presented by Mr. Bill Bracken of the International Code Council, Mr. Rod Scott of the International Association of Structural Movers, and Mr. Tom Little of SmartVent. In addition, this webinar has been approved for AIA, HSW, CFM, CEC, and ICC continuing education credits. Certificates of completion will be emailed out within 1 day of the completion of this training. You must attend the entire webinar to receive a certificate. Now about our presenters. Mr. Bill Bracken has been a senior instructor and subject matter expert for the International Code Council for more than a decade. Bill is also a structural engineer, licensed in 38 states, and a floodplain manager specializing in structures within special flood hazard areas. Mr. Rod Scott has over 25 years contracting experience, specializing in historic renovation projects and flood damage repairs. Rod has been involved in different areas of the structural elevation, flood mitigation industry. Rod pioneered post-flood disaster education outreach about elevation in upstate New York after Hurricane Irene, and redeployed an improved version after Sandy in New Jersey and New York. This effort won the ASCE FPM 2014 Floodproofing Award. Mr. Tom Little is Vice President of Smart Vent Products, Inc. and President of the Risk Reduction Plus Group, an insurance agency specializing in flood insurance. He is also a certified floodplain manager and a licensed insurance producer. Since 2004, Tom has studied the science of flood mitigation with a concentration on wet and dry floodproofing techniques, as well as how these systems and approaches can reduce flood insurance costs for property owners, as well as can protect structures. Today, our presenters will be highlighting the following: insight into the floodplain provisions of the International Residential and Building Codes, a step-by-step guide to elevation for existing structures and new construction, as well as FEMA and grant requirements, and how designs influence insurance rates for your residents and clients. You will have the opportunity to post questions throughout the webinar, which we will address at the end of the presentations. At this time, I would like to introduce Mr. Bill Bracken from the International Code Council.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you to everyone participating in the webinar. On behalf of the International Code Council, what I'm going to do is attempt to lay the groundwork for the rules and basically what's involved in dealing with structures within the floodplains. And what I'm going to do, as you see on this slide, is I'm going to start with just a general overview of the National Flood Insurance Program. I'm going to then move into some general rules that have been incorporated into the building code, as well as ASCE 24 and the role that it plays. And then I'm just going to end with some examples of the differences between some of the different zones, such as A zones and B zones. So to start with, and again, this is just a very high-level general understanding, but there are different types of floodplains. And so basically what a floodplain is an area that when we experience water, whether from rains or streams or coastlines, this is the low-lying areas that could be subject to flooding. And so we have different types of floodplains. We have on this screen here, you see a riverine floodplain, and that would be in the case of a river when it overflows its banks. The area subject to flooding would be the riverine floodplain. And then, of course, the coastal floodplains. The coastal floodplains in Texas's case will be along the Gulf Coast. And here are the areas that, when we have the storms and the surge, these are the areas that are going to see the flooding. Within each of the floodplains, there are different types of flood zones. The common flood zones are X, which means it is not susceptible to, or it is not expected to flood within the 2% in 100 years. The X, however, does not mean that it will not flood. And with the storms that we have seen over the last few years, we have areas that historically never experienced flooding that in the wake of these storms did experience flooding. The common areas that are anticipated to see floodwaters are the A zones and the V zones. The A zone is going to be most closely associated with the coastal areas. The water depths in an A zone can range anywhere from 0 to 36 inches deep. And then the coastal A, which is going to be along the coastline itself, there traditionally the water depths are going to range between 18 and 36 inches. On the coastal areas, however, once the water depth gets in excess of 36 inches, These are typically identified as V zones, and the V actually stands for velocity, meaning that as the water is coming in, it's basically surge. It's going to have velocity associated with it and energy, and it's going to do a substantial amount of damage. The actual locations of these zones can be found on the flood insurance rate maps, or the FERMs. The flood insurance rate maps are produced by FEMA and are made available online at no cost through FEMA's Map Center. You can simply go in, basically pull up your property address and identify the zones, the flood zones within your area. Now, it is important to note that not every area within the U.S. has been mapped, whereas other areas have several iterations of maps. The greatest iteration having recently occurred was due to the change in the vertical datum. When the maps were originally created in the late 70s and early 80s, they were based on the 1929 vertical datum. That datum, however, has been revised, and the maps are in the process of being revised, some of them for the second time or more. And the new vertical datum is based on the 1988 or the 1989 vertical datum. On this slide, you see an example of a map that was created through FEMA's website. Simply by going into the Map Center, entering the address, you can pull up the location of the physical property. In this particular case, you see the location is in an area on the page that is white. That indicates that it is inside of an X flood zone. And the dark shaded areas surrounding it are designated as either an A or an AE. The only difference between an A and an AE, the E standing for established, meaning that the depth of the waters, the flood waters, have been established based on historical data and or hydrologic maps. Now, as I said, part of this, well, one of the more important components of this is the vertical datum. Now, the elevation certificate forms that this slide talks about, and you'll see it on the next slide, is a form that was created so as to capture basic elevation information, especially on structures within the flood zone, so as to establish whether that structure is subject to flooding or not. The form has been expanded over time, and when navigating the form, it is actually very important to know whether you are on the 1929 or the 1988 vertical datum. On this slide, you see a screenshot of the form itself, and just to point out a couple of areas that are worth noting, in the upper right-hand corner, you see that the horizontal datum information is found and is to be provided on the form. There were also 2 horizontal datums established, so it's important to know which one you're using there. This has perhaps less to do with the likelihood of flooding and is used by many jurisdictions when establishing or verifying tie-in at the time the foundation is being placed. Below that is where you see the vertical datum information that is to be provided, and of course with an indication as to which vertical datum it's based on. On the upper left-hand corner, there is information on this form that is to be entered with respect to structures, enclosures, and venting of any enclosures that fall below the base flood elevation. And then finally down below is elevation data, and that is with respect to different features and aspects of the structure. Now, floodplain management has been around for a while, and historically, floodplain management was enforced through ordinances. The ordinances modeled after the National Floodplain Program. The floodplain management, however, is more than just buildings. Floodplain management is the management of construction and construction activities within the floodplains. And basically, anytime we build in a floodplain or add something to a floodplain, the water depths could potentially be increased as a result of that space being occupied by whatever it is that we're putting in there. So floodplain management is just managing the growth. Now, what happened is, as part of the floodplain management, there was development concerns, and then there were building concerns. Well, starting back with the 2003 and 2006 International Building Codes, the building provisions from the NFIP, the National Flood Insurance Program, were moved into the building codes. Initially, they were put in the appendices, and then starting with the 2009 and 2012 codes, they were moved into the body of the code itself. In addition to the requirements, the building requirements having been moved from the NFIP into the building codes, we also have additional requirements found within ASCE 24. And I'll talk about ASCE 24 in a little bit more detail a little bit later on in the talk, but basically the building code sets the prescriptive requirements, and ASCE 24 provides the methods with which one accomplishes those requirements. Now, getting into some of the provisions found within the building codes and ASCE 24, we'll start with some terms that were introduced. And these are terms introduced into the building code by the addition of the building requirements from the NFIP. One of the first terms that is critical to this entire program is the BFE, or base flood elevation. And simply put, what the base flood elevation is that is the depth that the waters within the flood zone are anticipated to rise to. And as I said, this is based on historical information and hydrological models. The base flood elevation is also the minimum elevation. So anything below the BFE within a flood zone is anticipated to flood. In addition to the BFE, we have the DFE, or the design flood elevation. And so what the design flood elevation is that is the elevation when we're building new that we are to build to. So the difference between the base flood elevation and the design flood elevation is something called freeboard, or the additional height that we are to add to the base flood elevation. So if I'm designing a structure in an area with a base flood elevation of 10, and my code or my municipality requires a freeboard of 2 feet, then the finished floor elevation is to be built to 12. So base flood is the, if you will, the elevation that the water is to rise to, and the design flood is the elevation that I am to build to. Oh, forgive me. One item that's worth note, in the International Building Code, that freeboard that I just referenced points to ASCE 24, because within ASCE 24, you have tables that provide values based on the type of structure, where it's located, just exactly how much freeboard will be required. Whereas in the International Residential Code, that freeboard requirement has been set to 1 foot. Now, in some municipalities that actually require more than 1 foot, that has created some challenges, but to the design professional, it's always worth noting that you need to check with the authority having jurisdiction so as to establish or verify what the freeboard requirements are. Now, one of the other items that we're going to talk about, one of the more significant additions made to the building code with the introduction of the NFIP requirements, is the dealing with existing buildings, or the substantial improvement, substantial damage rule. We'll talk about that in just a second. Flood hazard documentation. In addition to terms that were added, there were additional requirements put into the code, requirements placed on design professionals, basically setting minimum amounts or types of information that the design professional is to include in their permits or their plans, so as to demonstrate that the design has contemplated these flood requirements and has met these flood requirements. Within the code itself, you'll see these requirements referred to as V-zone requirements and non-V-zone requirements. So within a V-zone requirements, and at the end of this first part of the talk, we'll talk about some of the differences, but in a V-zone requirement, that is in the coastal area where I'm going to see surge and the depth of the water is going to be in excess of 36 inches. The non-V zone could be anything from a coastal A to an inland A, and the water might be rising only on the order of inches. There are differences, and the code differentiates between the two. An example, and this is with respect to additional information that is to be provided on the plans by the design professional. If I am dealing with a structure and it is in a flood zone and it is in an inland A, for example, my requirement is that my finished floor be at or above the design flood elevation. So on my plans, I need to provide the ground elevation, I need to provide the depth of the A zone, and then I need to provide the elevation of the floor slab itself. Whereas if I have say an existing commercial building, as you can see in this slide here, if I wish to make an addition to an existing commercial structure that is non-firm compliant, meaning that the finished floor is below the base flood elevation, I have that option, but I will have to then add additional information into my plans, such as contemplated in this slide. If I have an existing building, I can dry flood proof it, meaning keeping the water out. There are requirements that have to be met with respect to hydrostatic loads on the method I'm using to keep the water out, and measures that have to be taken to be sure and anchor the structure against any floating. But this is all information that has to be provided in the plans and permits submitted to the authority having jurisdiction. And then finally, an example of information that has to be provided when dealing with a structure in a V zone. V zones being very different. With the A zone, as I was talking about just a second ago, the object is to get the finished floor above the anticipated elevation of the floodwater, whereas in a V zone, the goal is to get not only the surface of my finished floor, but all of my structural components, my horizontal structural components, up and out of the water, so that when the surge comes in, it basically is not impacting any horizontal structural members. So in this particular case, when dealing with a structure in a V zone, the information that has to be provided on the plans would include not only the ground elevation and the depth according to the flood zone maps of the water, but the elevation of the bottom of the lowest horizontal structural member. Again, so as to verify that all of these components are up and out of harm's way. Now, I went through that very quickly, and there are a lot more requirements than I just covered, but FEMA, over the years, through its Building Sciences group, has compiled a number of examples and manuals on how to comply with all of these flood zone requirements. And on the screen here, you see the FEMA P55, which was the Home Builder's Guide to Coastal Construction. This was an example of a guide put together for contractors and builders to help them ensure compliance. And then moving on, I said that we would come back to this one, and more specifically with respect to this talk, and you're going to hear a lot more about this type of structure from both Rod and Tom, but to introduce the way the code handles it, when we have an existing structure that is found in a floodplain and the finished floor elevation is below the base flood elevation, meaning it is subject to flooding, when that structure is damaged or improved for whatever reason, whether fire, wind, or flood, when that property owner is considering repairing or improving that structure, if the cost of those repairs or improvements exceeds 50% of the value of the building, then you have what's called a substantial improvement or substantial damage. The significant being, once that happens, once that level of improvement or level of repair to damage has been committed to, that structure is required to comply with the flood provisions of the building code, meaning that the finished floor has to be elevated to the DFE or design flood elevation. Now, there are some basic steps, and what you see on this slide is a flow chart of those questions that I just ran through. But just to use this flow chart, when determining if my structure needs to be elevated or lifted, the first question is the cost of the repair or the improvement, does that exceed 50% of the value of just the building, not including the land, but just the building itself? If it does, is that structure in a flood zone? If it is, has the authority having jurisdiction adopted floodplain regulations and or the building code that would require an evaluation for substantial damage, substantial improvement? And then finally, is the interior floor above or below the base flood elevation? And again, if you get down through all of this and you say yes, then what you're facing is lifting that structure or elevating that structure so as to bring it into compliance with the flood regulations. Now, to emphasize, when I have a substantial damaged structure or a substantially improved structure, and I have to elevate that structure, what the code says is that I elevate that structure. I bring it into compliance with the flood provisions, not the entire code. The point here being, you can take an existing structure and elevate it without having to then bring every aspect of that existing structure into full compliance with current code. This slide emphasizing just that when that structure is lifted, whatever it is that I'm impacting, the foundation that I build, whatever services that I'm disconnecting and reconnecting, will have to obviously comply, but the balance of the structure itself that is being elevated is not required. When making or wrestling with a substantial improvement or substantial damage determination, this is another manual that has been put together by FEMA. This is the P758, or the Substantial Improvement, Substantial Damage Test Reference. This manual will walk you through the process, what is considered and what is not considered in making that determination. Now, when I have a structure that is non-firm compliant, meaning that the finished floor elevation is below the base flood, but whatever it is that I'm doing, improving or repairing, the value does not exceed 50% of the building itself, then I have what's called a non-SISD. In this case, I'm not required, or the code does not require me to elevate that structure, but the code does recommend that measures be taken to protect utilities and items that can be protected. And another example, here you see the FEMA P348. This is a guide put together on how to protect utilities both through elevation and wet floodproofing means, so as to minimize or mitigate any future damages or the extent of any future damages. And again, then there's another example. This is FEMA's Technical Bulletin 7, produced originally in '93, that provides some guidance on how to wet floodproof a structure. And what wet floodproofing is we're going to allow the water to come in, but we're going to protect those portions of the structure or those utilities within the structure from damage. Now, as I said a moment ago, without getting into a great deal of detail, ASCE 24 is the guide that the building code points to and directs design professionals to on how to complete or design, if you will, or comply with the requirements found in the building code. So within ASCE 24, you'll find tables providing basic freeboard requirements, how to design breakaway walls, how to design foundations, and the like. So some examples, and I'll wrap up with this, but just some examples taken from both the code and ASCE 24, and also to highlight some differences between A-zone construction and V-zone construction. So starting with A-zone construction, as I said a little while ago, if I'm building a structure within an A-zone, what the code requires is that I have my interior finished floor elevation at or above the design flood elevation. And the design flood elevation is based on the base flood elevation for that area, plus whatever the freeboard requirements are. So here, when I'm in an A zone, ASCE in table 2.1 provides what the various freeboard requirements are, and those recommended by ASCE. Some other examples, within an A zone, structural fill is permitted, but is limited to the building footprint. And what that means is I can build a structure on grade. They're in the structural fill. I can bring in fill soils and build a structure on grade in an A zone. Some requirements attached, such as the bottom of my footing needs to be below any estimated scour that may occur, but I am permitted to do that. But if you notice, it limits the fill to the footprint of the building. And the thinking there is that we want to minimize the impact on the floodplain, thereby reducing the amount of further elevation of the water as a result of us occupying that space. In addition, any enclosure below the design flood elevation is required to have openings, flood openings, and you're going to hear more about that from Tom. Here's an example, and Tom will give you some great examples, some pictorial examples. But on the left, you see a crawl space with a vented opening. There are requirements on the size and the location and how these openings are to perform. But basically what the code says is if you're going to build a structure, the water has to be able to flow freely in, around, and through the footprint of that building without damaging the building. And on the right, what you see would be an example of, say, a garage floor slab that is below the design flood elevation, therein requiring that it be vented as well. And then finally, to wrap up with, by way of comparison, in the V zones. In a V zone, as I said earlier, our concern is not the finished floor elevation. Our concern is the horizontal structural members. And here, we want all of our horizontal structural members up and out of the water. So here what we do is we take the estimated flood depth, we add the freeboard requirement, and then that is where we begin building up from. And here in V zones, because we're going to have water coming in, and it's anticipated that we're going to see some scour and erosion of the soils, structural fill is prohibited. In fact, in this setting, only piled foundations, deeper piled foundations are permitted. And that way, when the water comes in and washes back out and pulls the soils back out with it, it's not going to affect the structure, or should not affect the structure, thereby leaving the structure standing. But because we're going to have these floodwaters coming in underneath the structure, any walls down below my horizontal structural members are required to be breakaway. And in fact, any slabs on grade are required to be friable, meaning that they can break up and fall away without causing any damage to the structure. So I submit that to you as an introduction of the floodplain, the rules, what's in the code, and ASCE 24. And at this point, I will give it back to Kelly so that we can continue on.
Thank you, Bill, for your presentation. We actually have a couple of questions for you, Bill. First question, is it possible to experience flooding if I'm not located in a flood zone? And can I get flood insurance if I'm not in a flood zone?
Well, I will give the easy answer to both those questions is yes. You can experience flooding, and yes, you can get insurance. And actually, Tom is the expert on the insurance front, and he actually covers those very questions in his presentation. So,
thank you, Bill. Truly appreciate it. Great presentation. Again, as we move forward, please feel free to submit any questions you might have through the side panel on your screen. We will address these questions at the end of the presentation. Next, I would like to introduce Mr. Rod Scott from the International Association of Structural Movers.
Thanks, Kelly. Thanks to the ICC for organizing this event. It's really an honor and a great opportunity to share a lot of really important information over a large audience easily from my office in New Orleans, so it's great. I want to thank everyone for attending today. This is an important education program. Today I will be talking about flood mitigation elevation. I'm Roderick Scott, Certified Floodplain Manager, and I'm doing this on behalf of the International Association of Structural Movers. The ISM is sponsoring this segment. I provide consulting services to the ISM over the last several years. The organization members are professionals, contractors, insurance agencies, manufacturers, and others engaged in structural relocations and elevations. Since 1983, this organization has published several important industry books and how to do it communications, one of which we will go over today, the steps to elevation. All right, so here we are. This is Houston, post-Harvey. Pictures on the left, top, and bottom are a retrofitted elevated structure with flood vents circled there on that lower section. I believe those are non-engineered flood vents, which we're going to talk about. Very important to know the difference between non-engineered and engineered flood vents and their coverage capabilities. We get a lot of incorrect elevation certificates, and Tom's going to go over that in depth. So on the right, we have the examples of all of us are familiar with who have dealt with flooding, been involved with it for over 25 years, rebuilding them and now elevating them. And there's a lot of pain and heartache in that debris cycle right there. And unfortunately, Texas has had 3 major flood events in 3 years. So it's something that we can stop that cycle, break the cycle of repeated flooding, and that's what this is all about. So elevation works. It works on so many different levels. Just released at the end of last year, they've upped the ante on the savings for flood mitigation. Now saves $6 for every dollar spent. It saves $6 in disaster recovery costs. It also preserves property resale values. Elevated structures in the flood zone have excellent resale values, which is very important because resale values correspond to tax revenues, which keep everything running in our communities. Remember, 50% is 50 cents out of every property tax dollar goes to a local school, and then the rest is spread out amongst public safety, sewers, roads, and as we are required to do more and more resiliency activities with elevating roads and helping make the stormwater and sewer systems and water systems resilient, you are going to need strong tax revenue base. And in Texas, like Florida, very important because there's no income taxes, everything runs off of the property taxes. So very important to do that. Non-elevated structures with increasing flood insurance are losing value every year. It also greatly reduces solid waste stream to the landfill from both demolition and disaster debris removal. 3 floods in 3 years has had enormous debris removal, solid waste to the landfill. And as we know, construction and demolition debris is a major contributor to our solid waste landfills, which are finite in space. They're very expensive to open and maintain and close out. So the average house has 250 trees, wood frame house, and 30 cubic yards of demolition debris. So we keep that out of the landfill and preserve the structure and reuse the structure. And most importantly, we think elevation projects employ all construction trades. We employ concrete, carpentry, masonry, electrical, plumbing. It's a good little stimulus for your community. All right, let's look at the equipment that we use. We have some very specialized equipment and some very highly trained personnel in our very specialized industry. This is a unified hydraulic jacking system. This is recommended to be used on all elevation projects except for garages and sheds. This machine is an evolution of over 50 years of product development. It's built like a tank, basically just overhaul it every so often, and it works for 50, 60, 80 years. There's not a lot of built-in, what they call obsolescence. So basically it's about $100K for investment into the machine. Then we have hydraulic hoses, jacks, cribbing, steel, tools. You see 2 crew trucks right here with trailers. By the time we show up to your front door or the property owner's front door, it's about 250 grand invested in crew, equipment, and insurance. So it is a very capital intensive investment. It's a very labor intensive work, and we're very proud of the people that we have in our industry and very proud of the safety records. But this is some very specialized equipment. And what this does is it creates a simultaneous lift. Each one of those dial gauges on there is a port on the machine. It goes out with a big hydraulic hose to a jack. They set all the weights. You can have different weights on the building, a fireplace at one end and a wood frame structure addition on the other end. And you can lift the whole structure simultaneously by unifying all of those jacks in a single handle push. Actuates all of the jacks simultaneously. It is the least aggressive on a structure. Remember, no structure was ever built to be elevated or relocated other than manufactured housing. So we do occasionally get stress cracks above doorways and window jams, but it really limits the damages compared to individual jacking of structures. So we really appreciate this really specialized equipment. And here's our lifting steel, very thick flanged steel beams, very little deflection on them. And then we have the wood cribbing, which is basically the shoring, or if you imagine Jenga blocks, the little game, social game that we used to play, that's basically we stack those underneath the structure either direction until we get up to the bottom of the structure. We place the jacks inside the wood cribbing, which you see here on the right-hand picture, and put that blue jack head right up against that that steel that's going to be lifted. The cribbing supports the jack with that little base, that aluminum base that you see on the left-hand picture, and that is a 15-ton ram. We can have as many as 20 or 30 under a slab elevation of those 15-ton rams. We push the lever and it goes up in the air. It's really an amazing process to watch a slab such as the one on the right here, which was a 4,000 square foot home, 1-inch marble floors, about a 4-foot grade beam. This is a structural slab on pilings. So what we do is we go in and we drive segmented block pilings down into the soil until we hit refusal. And then we embed those pilings and the original wood pilings all into a new grade beam footing, and then either bring up in this case, we'd probably bring up a CMU block wall, chip off that rough texture, stucco everything, and you'll have a beautiful new elevated, safe from flooding home. Over on the left-hand side, you see the lifting crib assemblies where the jacks are inside. In addition, we can use the jacks on the pilings. Once those piles hit refusal, then we can actually lift off of those piles as well. That's on the left-hand photograph. We have a lot of requirements and regulations in the floodplain. We really respect the work of our professional engineers, structural engineers, and architects that have to interpret and interpolate all of the intersections of the flood insurance program, the engineering requirements, the code requirements. Luckily, as we go forward now with the ASCE 2414, the newest version of and the codes, the 2015 codes incorporate a lot of the NFIP and engineering requirements in the codes. So it is getting a little easier. It's not 3 distinctly different documents anymore. But this is not an easy environment. It's filled with hazards. Water has debris in it, and we have to build for the future for flood events, and that requires heavy-duty foundations. I call them battleship foundations. So let's talk about the steps to elevation, because it's very important to understand that these are basically construction projects in the scope of work, except for the elevation and the resetting of the structure onto the new or added to foundation. So when we talk about these steps, number 1 is the elevation certificate. It allows us to get a first flush image of where the ground elevation is, how high the flood minimum map elevation is. Of course, we never talk to people about elevating to the minimum flood map elevation. We always encourage a freeboard. Remember, every foot of freeboard enables an additional reduction in flood risk and flood insurance premiums. And if you're living near the coast, that ocean isn't going down, so it allows them more time to stay and more safety factor as the ocean comes up and the storms continue. So you only want to elevate once. You don't want to come back and add to the foundation, The next step after elevation, as we tell our children, is 2 generations from now, we'll be relocating a lot of people from the coast with their structures, I'm sure. We're just not going to abandon our society structures out in the ocean. So then we soil bore for foundation design parameters. Soil composition is very important in the design of the new flood-resistant foundation. If it's a slab, foundation slab on grade, we have to have an engineer, structural engineer, determine whether or not we can lift that slab, if it's a structural slab, or if we must separate the building from the slab. We can separate concrete block buildings from slabs, we can separate wood frame buildings from slabs, and we even separate stone and brick buildings from slabs. It takes different rigging for each of those, but it all can be done, and we have the experience in our industry to do these types of elevations off of slabs. If it's wood frame on a crawl space or a basement, that's no problem. We just go under the structure and actually lift it off of its current foundation. So construction drawings are best case estimates for the mitigation costs. Before the drawings are produced, we often in our industry work closely with property owners and the local communities to provide an estimate of the cost of the project based on a per square foot. Several of our larger companies like in our industry actually have developed, after thousands of structures, little software programs that can actually give a very close estimate without a firm set of plans, so that the communities can write their grants for the mitigation funding. And then we come back in, we do the construction drawings and get the accurate estimate for not only the actual grant funding, but the construction contracts. Then we look at financing, which we'll go over in our next segment. That can be a myriad of different sources of financing. We execute the project, permit and execute it, close it out, get a certificate of occupancy, and the property owners then can live free of flood worries and benefit from the much lower premiums and stabilized property and tax revenue values. So let's talk about the NFIP real quick before we talk about the financing, because this is a big topic now, and we feel it's really being underappreciated or misunderstood in communities. In many of our communities in this country, we have a very, very large number of pre-flood map buildings that have been basically subsidized on almost free insurance for 40-some years of the program because they were built before a flood map. Last 40 years, especially with the increase in storms over the last 10 or 15, the flood insurance program went into debt to the tune of billions of dollars, which our children are going to have to pay off. So the free ride is over with the pre-flood map buildings. Those buildings are rising to, their policy premiums are rising to actuarial rates. And the blue line right there is basically 2 feet below the map level. And it's not going to be pretty in communities with high numbers of these buildings. We really need to look at not rebuilding these pre-flood map buildings without a mitigation project, even if they're not substantially damaged, because the liability on the property owners is really not understood and appreciated at this point in their drive to get back to normal, even after 3 floods. Many of them now are severe repetitive loss, which is really devastating to the property owners without them knowing, because if they've had three big claims in 3 years and become an SRL, what we call an SRL, severe repetitive loss, their insurance increases, the premium increases go from 12% a year for primary residents to 25% a year. So instead of 14 years from now getting to that actuarial rate, in 5 or 6 years there'll be an actuarial rate, which is going to devastate neighborhoods with multiple flood events. And their values and and we can fix this. We just need to look at pulling on our big boots and fixing this. You can see on the left-hand side, this is the FEMA illustration. This graphic really illustrates it. If you're 4 feet below, which is many of the bayou neighborhoods in Houston, and even deeper once you get closer to the coast, $9,500 a year for a $250,000 residential policy. If you have a commercial policy at $500,000 a year, you basically double that number per year, and over 10 years, it's an enormous number. Whereas if we go 3 feet above the BFE, above the bare minimum, as we call it in our industry, look at that cost savings that can actually be put towards paying an owner's share of the financing of these projects, or certainly start looking at everybody's complaining about big 6 figures for slab elevations, but once we start talking about what these NFIP realities are going to be very shortly, we've got to get this fixed. It's a real big problem for our country. So let's talk about the funding. Funding is really at the core of all of this. The costs are what they are. Our industry, after tens of thousands of these elevations, really has a really good handle on the costs of these projects, and it is what it is. So we've got to figure out how to fund this stuff. And one of my favorite sayings is, in 2012 and 2014, Congress changed the NFIP rules, but didn't provide us any financial tools. We do not have any sort of low interest, long-term financing for this type activity, and it's really going to get painful quickly in the next 4 or 5 years. So we really need to figure out some other way to fund these, but these are the current funding mechanisms. Equity or cash. Equity that you have in your property that you can borrow against, or cash that you can pull down out of stocks, bonds, things like that can help fund the project. Cash is king, and of course, on a cash project, the contractor usually gets paid much quicker than in grant-funded projects at certain stages, benchmarks on the project, and so the cost of the elevation tends to be a little lower because the contractors have to account for that longer term payout, because remember, we're paying for materials and labor as we go, and if it's 30, 60 days on payouts from grant programs, we have to cost account that into our accounting systems and keep our operations running. So then we've got some grant programs. We've got a FEMA. These are all pre-disaster, of course. FEMA Flood Mitigation Assistance and the Hazard Mitigation Assistance Program basically are 2 grant funding sources from FEMA that really are targeting these multiple repetitive loss and severe repetitive loss structures. I think the latest numbers are that America's around or over 150,000 repetitive loss designated structures. And remember, those are just FEMA flood insured program buildings. As we know, in the last 3 floods in Texas and Louisiana, barely 25% of the people have been covered by flood insurance, which is just a horrible drain on our economic systems. And we've got to figure out how to get these buildings to where we're not repairing them repeatedly. And then the Federal Housing Administration has a program, a loan-to-mortgage program that can actually be used pre or post-disaster. It's called the FHA 203K. It's basically a construction loan that is converted to a typical 30-year mortgage. It's a little more involved application process than a standard mortgage, but we certainly encourage our financial institutions who are still kind of standing in the wings looking at all this, not understanding all of this property at risk with these rising insurance rates. So it can be written by any loan or mortgage company. Post-disaster, which is where we're at in many communities in this country, we've got the FEMA HMGP Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, which is 14% of the roughly of the total damages of the event. Comes back to the state in a block grant. We're very encouraged in Texas for the use of that program into the elevation projects. We're kind of disappointed that Florida, many of the counties have put them into capital drainage projects that have been unfunded by capital, really missing the mark on getting these pre-flood map homes mitigated. So good job, Texas, on recognizing the need for these elevations. And then we've got the HUD Community Development Block Grant. It's the CDBG-DR grant program. It's basically unmet needs. So all of your uninsured, low to moderate income property owners usually fall into this category. And it can help repair, and if those repairs are over 50%, it can be used to elevate. Some states, like New Jersey, New York, and Louisiana, have utilized these CDBG-DR grant funds to create elevation programs, not just rebuilding, but full-fledged elevation programs. And here in Louisiana, we're up to 36,000 elevated structures since Katrina. My community is over 74% elevated. 3 days later, we're back in business, except for the 30 that we're still trying to get up in the air. 7 hurricanes in 14 years. Pretty devastating for any community, but we're rising above it. And then Small Business Administration, the SBA, if you are substantially damaged and you qualify for an SBA loan, you can get an additional $200,000 for an elevation project to bring that structure into compliance through the NFIP. Very important program that's really been under the radar, but now is really being touted by the SBA. Okay, so let's switch gears just a little bit here, and let's talk about being an elevation prepared state and communities. Like I said, we've got a long record of elevation here in Louisiana. We really have learned a lot here. There is a lot to learn as a state and communities when you're doing these elevation programs in large numbers. What we've learned, and other states have learned as well, that you must create an elevation contractor registry. Their backgrounds need to be checked. When you drop $1 billion into an area to start elevating, after Katrina, we had 6 contractors or 8 contractors before Katrina. A year and a half later, with $2 billion on the ground, we had 150. We dropped 12 slab houses and crushed 6 men, and that's not where anybody wants to go. It really gets people worried about their structures. It creates doubt in the program, and you need to have strong, backed elevation contractors with experience doing this work in your state. We know that Texas is a pretty low regulation state, we'll call it, with not much contractor requirements. This is nothing to mess around with. You want to get it right going into it and not suffer any back steps with accidents with unqualified people. You get $2 billion on the ground, somebody's going to go try and buy a machine and get some jacks and start trying to jack up buildings to make money. And it's not the place to have starter companies. We've got a lot of good contractors in this country that specialize in this. And a lot of times they will partner with your local GCs to just provide the lift services and move on to the next project. So a lot of your general contractors have a lot of business opportunity in here to work with our industry. Let's talk about some insurance requirements for these registries. You definitely want to make sure that there's a liability coverage, workman's compensation coverage, and then the most important is once that structure is up off its foundation, the homeowners or the liability of the contractor's insurance will not carry it. It becomes literally a cargo. So there's different names for this insurance. Different companies call it different things, but it's basically a care and custody of the property insurance. It's named riggers or cargo, and it should always be for the replacement value, at least, of the structure on that. And we also, I don't have it in here, but a lot of states have now gone to requiring bonding for these projects. They'll allocate a certain number of projects to contractors, but they need to have completion bonds, assurance bonds, to make sure that if there is some sort of financial failure in that company, that there is revenue there to complete those projects. And I don't have that in here, but that was something that was mentioned by a previous viewer of the program. And we think that legitimate companies that have been in business, that have good experience and are healthy cash-wise, can afford the bonding for requirements. And we found that that was really helpful up in New York and New Jersey as an industry to make sure that that projects aren't sitting there unfinished due to some sort of failure in the financials of the company. You want to streamline your variance procedures and permitting processes. Remember, there's two types of permits in the floodplain. One is renovation, one is new construction. There's no checkbox normally for elevation. You're going to want to keep a collection of data of how many structures you've elevated. This is really important as we go forward, because Moody's and Standard & Poor's credit rating agencies are now saying that if you're not mitigating your community, either through infrastructure or your buildings, you're going to have to pay a whole lot more in revenue bonding for resilience projects in the future. And so you're going to want to have that data. My community, 74% elevated. They had never tracked which one, so they had to go back through all the permits, 700 some permits, and try and figure out, was that elevated retrofit or was that new construction, and all that stuff. So make sure you document your elevations. All of our elevations of these pre-firm buildings are pretty much pre-zoning requirements with setbacks and things like that. So if you do have modern zoning requirements for setbacks, a lot of times they will be non-conforming structures. So in my community, for instance, it's a 2-week wait to get hearing in front of the zoning commission, $100, and boom, we're streamlining this. We're wanting people to get this process underway. I was in a community over in Florida helping a project, and they told me it was a 90-day wait, $4,000, and you had to hire a lawyer. Let's make this easy for the people, and we're going to need to do a lot of them. We estimate 40,000, 50,000 of these pre-flood map buildings down in the Harrison, Galveston County areas. So we've got a lot of work to do, but we can do it. So we're not, as Bill said, this is a NFIP compliance project, not a substantial improvement, and therefore, we want to do our air conditionings with contractors and licensed electricians and plumbers to code, but that's just for the reconnects. So we're not tearing the whole house apart and rewiring everything and bringing everything up to modern codes. We're just getting that thing off the ground so we don't have to go back and do it again. So this is our program. If you want to get a copy of the recording afterwards, or if you want to jot down this internet address, we've created this program for property owners, for communities to offer to property owners on behalf of our industry. There's a budget page on there to where they can start filling in things like porta potties and permits and soil borings, and how much is it going to cost to lift and reset my structure, and how much is the foundation going to cost. That whole scope of work is in there on that thing. And so I know I am running short on time here, so I'll just finish up. This is our moonshot. 3 million of these buildings in this country, $1 trillion worth of construction, we think, in the next 20 years, or we've lost value in those structures. And many of them are in our core areas of our communities, close to the central business districts. We've got to get these homes up. We've got to fix the commercial buildings. You guys sent people to the moon. Texas sent people to the moon in 10 years from deciding to start it. We got to put on our big boots and we got to do this, and you will have resilient communities that will withstand and respond quickly back from future floods, which we know are going to happen. So let's do it together. We're here to help you, and we even have contractors that are currently moving into the area based on contacts that I've had with several of our industry leaders. Competition breeds good pricing, and we're going to need a lot of specialty contractors to get 40, 50,000 buildings up off the ground. So thank you very much for your attention today to this program. I'm always available for personal questions, and I'll open it up for questions at this point.
Thank you, Rod, for your presentation. We actually do have a comment here, and this is a comment from that she is addressing. She said, in addition to bonding, third-party warranties are also a good requirement to protect homeowners from sketchy contractors. Would you like to remark about that?
Yes, we started that with the Road Home program after Katrina and Rita. Remember, we had 2 hurricanes in 30 days. The city wasn't even pumped out yet. Definitely there are warranty programs out there that these contractors can offer. We highly recommend it. In addition, we recommend that these never be a municipal project with low bidding. We have some communities in New Jersey that are doing them as municipal projects, and there's just way too much costs associated with that, and burdens and liabilities for the taxpayers in the future. So we believe in the private contractor and the property owners doing the contracts, and the government holds the money and pays the contractors. But yes, warranties are a good thing, and we certainly support them in our industry.
Thank you, Rod. Truly appreciate a great presentation. At this time, I would like to introduce Mr. Tom Little from SmartVent.
Thank you, Kelly. And Rod, excellent job, buddy. That was super informative, and Bill as well. And what I'm going to try to do in this last segment is really to build upon what Bill talked about with the International Code Council residential and building codes, those very important ASCE 24 requirements, and then tie it all back to the flood insurance side of things, the NFIP. And to build off of what Rod was speaking about when we're talking about elevating these structures up into the air, keeping them nice, high, and dry, I want to hit on one of the, it's a small item when you look at the scope of work that's being done, but it's a big driver in flood insurance costs, and that's compliancy with flood openings. And so we'll dive into those details throughout this last segment, and kind of tie it back to what Rod and I kind of phrased this as lift and vent, right? You got to elevate, you got to lift, and you got to vent properly. And from there, you're going to secure those low flood insurance premiums. Now, let's hit on the flood insurance coverages for a minute. We'll talk about the National Flood Insurance Program first, which we can see in the left-hand column. And essentially, you can purchase NFIP flood insurance coverage for your residential property. These are 1 to 4 family structures, so we'll classify this as residential. You can purchase up to $250,000 in building coverage and up to $100,000 in contents coverage from a residential standpoint. And the deductibles vary, from $1,250 all the way up to $10,000. Now we have deductibles. Business structures, you can purchase up to $500,000 in building coverage and $500,000 in content. So increased coverage amounts there. Both the buildings and the contents have separate deductibles, which is something that most policyholders don't understand. To be honest with you, most policyholders don't even understand what type of flood insurance coverage they have, let alone if they even have it. Still, a lot of folks think that it's covered, flood is a peril covered by their homeowners, which it is not, right? And so that kind of ties back to outreach, which we'll talk about in a minute. But many of our structures exceed the limits that we have through the National Flood Insurance Program. And that's where the private flood insurance sector comes in. And we're kind of hitting on those points on the right-hand side. Many homes in the flood area are going to exceed the value of $250,000 in structural coverage, building coverage. And so through the private sector, you can buy what's called excess flood coverage. So you can purchase flood insurance well above $250,000 and in many cases well above $1 million in coverage, including increasing your contents coverage to $500,000 and more. And a nice thing about the private sector, they will also include in many of their policies additional living expenses, where the NFIP will not cover temporary living expenses if you're displaced from your home after a flood. Now listen, the private sector is selective with the risk that they're taking. So there's excess flood insurance policies, and now I read a report just yesterday in Insurance Journal, 15% of the flood insurance policies in the United States are now with the private market. And these are primary policies, equivalents to the NFIP. But there is some risks there that you have to be careful of, because after a flood, they could drop you. Okay, but in the meantime, these policies do provide you great coverage that exceed the NFIP in many, many cases, and are typically like Lloyd's of London backed products. So they are very well-rated policies that will pay out in the event of a flood. Our particular agency had a lot of folks in Harvey that had this private policy in particular, and those claims were actually paid out a couple months prior to the NFIP claim. So there are some benefits there, but the risks they're selective with, and they use catastrophe modeling to choose who they're going to take on and who they're not going to take on. And the catastrophe models are very sophisticated. They incorporate not only FEMA data, but they also include historical data from previous floods. And when I say tens of thousands of different flood scenarios, it's no exaggerations. They really model in every hypothetical type of flood that could occur in a community to rate the risk. So that's something that differentiates them. Now, from one of the myths, my agent told me I'm not in the flood zone, I don't need to purchase flood insurance. Holy cow. We have to stop that as a flood community. Everybody should have flood insurance. That's one of my I hope you take away one thing from this entire segment that I'm going to do. It's everybody should have flood insurance. If you can see flood water from your house, if you can see water from your house, whether somebody told you you're in a flood zone or not, purchase a flood insurance policy. If you're in an X zone, yes, I'm not in a special flood hazard area, an A or a V, but I'm in an X zone. Mother Nature doesn't listen to the maps. It's not going to stop at your neighbor's house just because they're in an A zone and not potentially flood your property, which falls into an X zone and that 500-year flood elevation, right? So in most cases in X zones, you can purchase a preferred risk policy for around $30 a month. $30 to protect your most valuable asset that you own. Folks will purchase a smartphone, right? And they'll buy insurance on their smartphone for $12, $15 a month. Well, for another $15, we can buy flood insurance for our home. So buy a preferred risk policy. Whether you're in a special flood hazard area or not, you need flood insurance. And why? Floods are expensive. 1 inch of flood water can cause up to, $21,000 in damage in a 2,000 square foot home. What we saw in Harvey, we had 3, 4, 5 foot of flood water through these slab on grade structures that really caused a lot of damage. We're focusing on residential applications within the flood areas, but it's important to note from a commercial standpoint, now Bill hit on this, dry flood proofing commercial buildings. When we talk about recovery, here's a property that was affected by Hurricane Sandy. Those are shopping carts full of inventory for that supermarket. That inventory could have been used for recovery after the storm if they maybe would have had those walls hardened, and they very well could have been hardened walls designed to take on structural load. We maybe just needed flood barriers or flood shields in front of these doors, windows, and other openings within this building, and it would have protected that inventory. So from a commercial standpoint, dry flood proofing can make a big impact to make a building resilient. But with regards to residential, Wet flood proofing is the technique that you're utilizing. On the left-hand side, you see an elevated house up on a crawl space. This particular home went through Harvey. This was in the Meyerland area, the community of Meyerland in that Houston area. Went through Harvey. Water did not reach the first living floor of that property. To the right, we have a slab on grade house. We see a huge debris pile after that home was gutted out after Harvey. It's all on the curb line. The family is displaced. The house on the left-hand side, no damage, family still in there. Here's another great example. We talked about elevation with Rod. We are able to lift a slab on grade house. In some cases, we're disconnecting from the slab. In other cases, it's maybe a structural slab and we can lift that up as one of Rod's pictures illustrated. But the point is, take away from this presentation that you can take a slab on grade house and get that sucker elevated up in the air and put a enclosed space underneath a supporting foundation. And if you have proper flood vents, the property will survive like this middle house right here. The house on the left of it and the house to the right of it did not experience the same luck as this middle house. So this particular home was at the same elevation, which was a -4 as compared to the base flood elevation to the house on the left and the house on the right. They elevated it up after the tax day flood, after the Memorial Day flood in that Houston area. And then when they were flooded during Harvey, it survived with no damage. So just a big takeaway, the elevation techniques that we're talking about, they really do work. Now, Rod spoke to flood insurance premiums on the rise. They're going up drastically. We've been seeing this since 2012 with the Bigger Waters Act going into effect. Since then, we've had the Homeowners Flood Insurance Affordability Act passed in 2014 that slowed down the phase out of these subsidized rates. The key thing, although affordability is in the HIFA Act, it is very important to let our property owners know it's a Band-Aid. It's only slowing down those increases. Eventually, you will top out at your actuarial risk rating. Now, it's important to talk to your residents, your customers, your clients about what needs to be done if you have an existing structure. What's the first step to figure out how am I going to lower my premium? Well, FEMA's sending out, the NFIP, pardon me, sending out with the renewal letters, a great flyer, and it's pretty basic, some helpful graphics. Option 1, do nothing. Well, listen, hope really isn't a strategy, so that's option 1's no good, right? What's option 2 say? Get an elevation certificate. Option 2 is what we're going with, and the elevation certificate plays a critical role. Now, when we're speaking about what you can do to lower your flood insurance premium, get an elevation certificate. Most homeowners don't know what the heck you're talking about. So take a step back. How do we educate our residents on what's going on with the flood insurance premiums? How do we answer their questions one-on-one? We need to do those in the form of outreaches. Our particular agency has done a lot of these since Hurricane Sandy, and they also contribute to CRS credits via Section 330, public outreach. And it allows homeowners to get their questions answered for their particular situation, get their situation evaluated by an agent. So look into doing outreaches in your community. They can make a great impact. Plus, you're getting credits, which are going to potentially help to lower the flood insurance premiums for them anyway in the form of that CRS discount. But the elevation certificate is step 1. You need this form to be able to determine how high I'm going to have to elevate. You need this form to be able to determine what your actuarial risk rating is going to be. There is a few problems that we see on a daily basis with elevation certificates. 1, house is properly elevated, but there aren't proper flood vents. Okay, if we don't have proper flood vents in the enclosed space below the design flood elevation, the DFE, then we cannot exempt that space from flood insurance rating, meaning that it is susceptible to potential flood damage due to the buildup of hydrostatic pressure. So the NFIP charges you a higher premium in those situations. The number 2 problem we see is they're not being filled out correctly, right? The diagram number associated with the building that was maybe elevated is filled out wrong. And one example is, like Rod spoke about, we're taking a slab on grade structure, elevating it up on a raised floor foundation, and we're seeing homes that are, they have an 8-9 foot enclosed space below the elevated first floor, and it's not subgrade. It should be a diagram 7, but the surveyor put down diagram 1A, which is for slab on grade. And we're thinking, why did they put diagram 1A? Here, it's because there was a concrete slab on the inside. So they thought, well, slab on grade, right? Everything's built in the compliance. It has proper flood vents, but they put diagram 1A. Now, mind you, that enclosed space can only be used for parking, storage, and building access, not living area. And in most cases, that's what we're seeing. It's totally in compliance. Well, what happens from a flood insurance standpoint, when you process this elevation certificate data through the insurance software, through a write your own, it's a diagram 1A is associated with a non-elevated structure. It doesn't even ask you about flood vents. So it pulls the rate tables for a slab on grade home rather than an elevated structure. So it's important we get those building diagrams correct. There is a myth with the elevation certificate. There is a fear that if a homeowner that is in a pre-firm structure wants to get the elevation certificate, the cat's going to be out of the bag. The government will know that I am a higher risk than what I'm paying right now for my flood insurance premium. That is incorrect. The EC will never hurt the property owner. It will only help them. I have seen many cases where this certificate alone submitted in decreases the premium. So we're talking a couple $100 depending on where you are in the country to get an elevation certificate done, and the form alone reduces the premium by a couple thousands of dollars because it shows what the actuarial risk on the property is. And here the property owner's been paying more in flood insurance premium. So get rid of that myth in your community. The elevation certificate will only help. And it's the blueprint to know how high we have to elevate. What steps can be done to lower your premium. On average, reasonable mitigation such as flood vents or filling in a subgrade space that is below the DFE, it will reduce a flood insurance premium on average about 70% from the data that we collect on an annual basis. So it really helps. So let's talk about what we experienced in Texas and Harvey affected communities such as this Meyerland house. When we talk about elevation, we're talking about resilient structures. Rod spoke to that. The building codes require you to elevate that first living floor above the BFE plus any freeboard, depending on your building code you're working off of. 2015 I codes, 1 foot. I am so thrilled, and we got to give a shout out to Harris County for passing new ordinance that are going to require 500-year elevations. Jamila Johnson, floodplain manager for the city of Houston, and her team working to get city of Houston's ordinance up to speed. And they too have language in there to elevate to the 500-year elevations. This is going to help. Freeboard works. Here's a quick story. This particular house sitting on this lot prior to this elevated house was a slab on grade home. It went through in previous storm, Memorial Day flood, tax day flood. It had proper flood vents in the crawl space. So what happened is the architect tore down the slab on grade house, built this beautiful house up on a crawl space, elevated the first floor with 1 foot of freeboard. Okay, that's important. 1 foot of freeboard. Had proper flood vents. These were mechanically operated, engineered flood vents that were ICC evaluation service evaluated and had a report. So those are in the foundation to relieve hydrostatic pressure. We had our AC units up here on a platform above the DFE. So this house was properly wet flood proofed. This house was hit by Harvey shortly after construction was completed. David DePuma, the architect that designed this home, was getting ready to list it. He got a frantic call from his neighbors. They were in a big panic. They said, David, we need to get into your house next door. What's the key code on the door? So he gave it to him. And that family next door was in such a great panic because their home was taking on water. They needed to get their family out. They didn't evacuate in time. They literally took their children, put them on pool floats, floated them over onto this porch, and took refuge in this house for 2 days. 2 full days. This picture was one that they took shortly after they got up on the porch, and flood water came within this first step. It came within 6 inches of overtopping this step, and then that would have ran into the first living floor of the house. Freeboard worked. Freeboard worked. So not only did this house survive the storm, freeboard did its job. The flood vents relieved the hydrostatic load on the foundation walls, but we saved lives. All right. And so when we're talking about elevation, we're talking about saving lives. When we're building back these homes that are slab on grade, Rod said it best. We really need to be thinking for the future. And what can we do to protect these structures? How can we raise them up? How can, and if we can't elevate them, what other methods can we utilize? All right. And so there's no answers there yet, but we need to work towards it. So shortly after the flood, I proceeded. David DePuma was able to get the sod in, put this house up for sale. Now, when we talk about a resilient structure, this also retains home values. He sold this house in less than a week, and he had this little sign in the back, and you'll see this all around in Houston now. This house was not flooded. It sustained no damage. There were no claims to the NFIP. Everything was structurally sound. We are documenting what's working. That's why our codes, our standards, our regulations improve. Every 3 years, the ICC puts out a new IRC and a new IBC. ASCE 24 was just recently updated in December of 2014. That is going through review right now. That will have a new release in the next year or two. KHOU, CBS affiliate, documented David DePuma's story so others could learn. That's David right there, the architect, doing a report. This is the house behind him. That's where the family that took refuge in his house came from. And so he was explaining how they came through the fence out the back on their pool floats to get their family safe and sound. But here's the other added value. We talk about flood insurance costs. Because that house was elevated 1 foot above the base flood elevation, it had proper flood vents to exempt that lower enclosed space. The premium for the property was $713 a year for full coverage. If that was a 2 foot above the base flood elevation, it would be in the $618 range. From a 500-year elevation requirement, what's coming with Harris County and the city of Houston, now you might be at a +3, a +4. Which you're really taking full advantage. You're in the $500 range for flood insurance coverage. So it really drives down the cost. That slab on grade house directly behind David DePuma, when that hits its actuarial rate, it's a -4, it will be close to $10,000 a year for flood insurance. So financially, they're not going to be able to afford to stay in that home. We're going to have to do something. So again, just to tie back the flood vents, because this is the #1 red flag that we see, especially with newly elevated structures, whether it's taking an existing one and elevating it like Rod showed, or if it's new construction. What's the objective of a flood vent? Well, it's quite simple. It's to relieve pressure off of foundation wall or supporting wall of any enclosed space below the design flood elevation. So it's required in your crawl spaces, your full height enclosures. I spoke to the elevation certificate building diagram. Those are your diagram 7s. But we're relieving hydrostatic pressure, lateral forces. When you have subgrade spaces, big no-no in the floodplain. Why? You're going to deal with saturated soil pressures. You're going to deal with greater buoyancy forces. And in those situations, that's when we're typically filling in that space to create a non-subgrade space. And you're abandoning that lower enclosed space to maybe create a crawl space, but you're going to drastically lower your flood insurance premium. So here's the visual aids. I think enough is said really by just looking at these pictures, but lateral forces build up on a wall. If you don't have proper flood vents, the wall can collapse. You can have significant structural damage. One of the characteristics of a compliant flood vent, it needs to allow water to enter and exit. So you see these blocks on the outside? Maybe there was flood vents in this, maybe there weren't, but the water came out quicker than what the wall could equalize the load, and that's why those blocks are on the inside. So bidirectional equalization is critical. Buoyancy forces, when flood water hits the superstructure, that's when that house can float. The block shearing here, what's an important takeaway is there's debris in flood water. It can clog a flood vent if the vent is not designed to mechanically open, like we see over here on the left-hand side. So wet flood proofing is key. One of the key documents with regards to flood vents is FEMA Technical Bulletin 1 from August of 2008. They give you all the details of flood vents, how many you need, the enclosed spaces that need them, different types, non-engineered versus engineered. It's important. Get your AC units up on platforms above the DFE. Hang your air handler from the ceilings. But with regards to equalization, it's quite simple. And performance is part of the ASCE 24 requirements and the International Code Council Evaluation Service acceptance criteria for mechanically operated flood vents. And those state that you cannot have a 1 foot differential at any time during a flood between the exterior and the interior flood levels. All right, so no more than 1 foot. So this would be a failure on the left-hand side. Maybe this was a non-engineered vent. Maybe it was clogged with debris. Maybe there weren't enough openings. This can also lead to storage capacity issues. Now, floodwater, even if the wall doesn't give away, water is not able to fill that space and be stored in the crawl space, so it can increase your flood levels. And maybe that takes floodwater from not being into your living floor to being in your living floor. So what are we looking for? Perfect equalization like we saw on the right-hand side. 2 different types of flood openings, non-engineered openings, and then there are ICCES evaluated engineered openings, and then there's unique project-specific engineered openings, but we're just going to hit on mass-produced engineered flood openings that are on the marketplace. We'll start with non-engineered openings. These are devices, by definition, not designed as a flood opening, right? Non-engineered, not designed. And when you use non-engineered openings, there's going to be permanent obstructions to flow, and at least the minimum with regards to the code, a screen, because you just can't have an open hole in your foundation. You'd have rodent potential issues there, right? So when you're using a non-engineered opening, you need 1 square inch of net open area for every 1 square foot of enclosed area. So just think 1 for 1, 1 for 1. What's important is a 16 by 8 inch hole with an air vent device inserted in it does not measure 128 square inches. You must account for the obstructions to flow. Here's a vent that's seen in the Gulf Coast, made out of concrete. It's got a permanent fixed screen. You can't pry that off of that vent there. But, you know, 16 by 8 or 15.5 by 7.5, which this measures, does not measure 116 square inches. You account for these obstructions, you know, all this area. You can only count what's free of any obstruction. Now, granted, there's a screen, and in many of the building codes, those screens can clog almost up to 50% of any of the net open area. So just something to be careful of. This vent, when it measures out and you only count the net open area, it covers 32 square inches of net free area. So again, we're back in that Houston area. We have a house that was elevated. It has that vent in the foundation. Now, granted, in this particular case, there was no structural damage due to pressure. The house next door, slab on grade, there you go, another debris pile. But in this particular house, if it was a 2,000 square foot crawl space, that house would need 63 of these vents around the perimeter of the foundation to comply to the non-engineered opening requirements. I can tell you there were not 63 of those vents in that foundation. So if there was an adjuster coming out and they identified lack of venting, it would increase the premium as it made it back to underwriting. So just be aware, even if this, the property has a CO, and you see the surveyor maybe measured this vent, because they're going to give you pictures with the EC, and they measure it at 128 or 115. If it's anything but 32 square inches, you want to throw up the red flag and check in on that. These air vents clog with debris. I think we got that point across. You need to be careful with them. We've seen it in Meyerland. The ASCE 24 has requirements, great commentary to their standards that state if the device is known to clog with debris, avoid using it. This is what we've seen all across the country. This is an open hole with a screen on it, and you can see how it collected debris. That was in the Harvey area as well. Just to wrap up, ICC evaluated engineered openings. These are vents that are designed, tested, and certified for performance. They're going to mechanically open and allow that floodwater and debris to pass in and out to equalize pressure and not clog. Here's a picture of one particular mechanically operated flood vent that went through Hurricane Ida in 2009. What's important, debris is coming from the inside out, right? So it got in, vent allowed the automatic entry, and now the automatic exit of floodwaters out of that space. But the basis of the operation, there's little floats in this particular device's design. Those floats lift with buoyancy. So normally it's locked in the closed position, doesn't operate like a doggy door, rodent resistant, remember. But as water rises up, it fills the slots on the right and the left. The door pivots open to reveal an unobstructed opening. Floods in Peoria, Illinois. This is just recently. Here the vents are in the open position, allowing that debris to flow through. These were activated from the inside out. So when we're talking about automatic entry and exit, when you have directional flow flowing from the east to the west or the north to the south, you're going to place your flood vents according to that potential flow. Sometimes your north-facing wall will experience that floodwater first and then would need to activate the south-facing vents next. So they have to work in both directions, as I stated before. These devices that are evaluated through the ICC come with an evaluation report. the vents will have a label. This makes it super easy to identify. The NFIP is looking for this documentation for mass-produced engineered flood openings. It's going to state the model number, the certified coverage that the vent covers. So there's no guesswork with net open area and trying to figure out these complex dimensions of these air vents. This vent here is certified to cover 200 square foot of enclosed space. And just to wrap up, placement requirements, whether you're looking at the I codes, the ASCE requirements, or any of the FEMA NFIP regs, flood vents need to be on 2 different walls for whatever enclosed area is below the BFE. You can go to FEMA Technical Bulletin 1 for a whole list of all the different types of enclosed spaces that would require flood openings. But I get a question a lot, hey, a 10 by 10 enclosed space is 100 square foot. If I'm using a device that covers 200 square foot, do I just use one? And the answer is no, you still need a minimum of 2 openings, and they need to be placed on 2 different walls to allow the flow in and flow out. We can see an example over here in this townhouse situation, vents in the garage door, vents on the sidewall. That was an oops, right? They forgot the flood vents, so they had to retrofit those in. When you have a middle unit in a townhouse, you oftentimes have dividing walls separating, meeting the 2 different wall requirements. So we would put flow-through openings in this dividing wall to join the spaces up. Make sure if that's a fire-rated wall, you're using a product that has a fire rating kit associated with it. And then the other placement requirement, and you can find this on page 2 of FEMA TB1, have your flood vents within 12 inches, no more than 1 foot or 12 inches above the highest adjacent grade directly below that opening. So it's measured from the interior or exterior, whatever's the highest between those two. The vent needs to be within 12 inches. And here you can see a block foundation. It applies to CMU. It applies to poured concrete wall or concrete foundations. It applies to framed walls. We're seeing a lot of this now with the new ASCE 24 requirements that are also in the I codes that breakaway walls, regardless of flood zone, A zone and V zone, in breakaway walls, you now are required to have proper flood vents in those walls. So you're seeing a lot more framed wall installations for flood openings, but the rules still apply within 12 inches. And here's what it looks like in the foundation when it's done right. We have 2 different walls here within 12 inches. Same thing with this full height enclosure. 2 different walls. This is that Peoria, Illinois house that just went through a flood. Great case study on this one. Rob Wagner saved 75% on his flood insurance with this retrofit, which was a house that was elevated post-firm, but they forgot to put in proper flood vents, right? So great story there. You can, send me a note after this webinar if you'd like to hear more about that story. And then just to summarize at the end, this vent wouldn't be compliant because it's more than 1 foot above the highest adjacent grade directly below the opening. And this particular device was not broken in the open position. If you're using a non-engineered opening, any closing device has to be broken off to make sure that it's going to allow for the entry of an exit of flood waters. But mind you, that's a screened opening, so you're measuring only the net open area. So you'd have a lot more of those vents if you did not have mechanically operated engineered flood vents, as you see over here. In closing, I want to thank you very much. You will receive an email that will include Bill's contact information, Rod's contact information, and also mine. So feel free to shoot us any questions after the webinar. That should come to you tomorrow. Kelly, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Tom, for your presentation. Due to the essence of time, we're a little bit over. We will be responding to your individual questions via email, but there is one question, Tom, I wanted you to answer because we had a number of people submit this, and it is about PDF versions of the presentation. Will registrants receive a PDF of the presentation? Will this be made available?
Yes, that's a great question. And so in the follow-up emails that will go out tomorrow to all attendees, you will receive your certificate of completion along with a link to download the recorded version of this presentation. And in that downloadable link, you also have the PDF of this PowerPoint that you can save. And we will address any of the open questions individually with that person via email as well. We do collect those. Those don't get lost, so we have record of all of those.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Rod, and thank you, Bill, for your presentations today. At this time, we'll be concluding this webinar. If you would like more information about any of these topics, please feel free to contact me, Kelly Sadler, and we will get in touch with our presenters. We hope you all have a wonderful day, and thank you for participating and Learn to Build with Resilience in Mind.